Well, hi, folks. Thank you for joining us. I am Ken Sax, and you are watching and listening to Real Estate Talk. And my guests today are Flann and Tanya Tyler, both with Keller Spokane. And we're going to be talking about consumers. This is for you, and this show is going to be directed towards I'm entering the market, whether I'm buying or selling. What things do I look for, do I ask in choosing the correct realtor? There's lots of realtors out there, so there must be a system or there must be some type of process I should follow, because after all, we're talking about the biggest investment in most cases in our lives. So we're going to talk about those things that a consumer should consider when making such an important decision. So that's the show. Again, my guests, Flann, Tanya Tyler, thank you for being here.
Hey, it's good to be here, Ken. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. So why don't we just get into it? First, we're going to talk about sellers. I'm considering selling my house, or I am going to be selling my house. And then we'll shift into I'm a buyer now, because I'm assuming there are going to be some different things, different questions that I'm going to want to ask my prospective realtor. So you guys, I feel like I'm interviewing a realtor right now.
Well, you are in some sense. Hello.
So I am considering selling my house, or I am selling my house. What are some things that should be important to me, and what are some things I should be asking prospective listing agents or prospective realtors?
Well, I think even just to start things off, the way you defined buyer and seller, there's obviously a clear distinction there, and the market is very different depending if you are the seller or you're the buyer. So right now, if you're a seller with the inventory as low as it is, somewhere just over 1 month, when a balanced market for buyers and sellers, 5 to 6, that means that if you're interviewing to sell your home, there's going to be very different questions to ask. And so, before we met here just a few minutes ago, you had brought up kind of 3 things that realtors often do, and I think, Tanya, you'd written that down, the last one being pray. So when it comes to listings, there can be a tendency among some realtors, because the market is hot, to just kind of set it and forget it. So, Tanya, what's your experience with that and the other 3?
I love that. Well, I think that you want to make sure that you don't just, and a lot of agents do this, is they just put a price on the house, put the sign in the yard, and then they pray. I hope that buyers are going to come, because I know there's a lot of buyers out there. So that's kind of one of the mistakes that when you're going to sell your house, a lot of agents will just come in and do, because it's easy and simple. So that's what you're talking about with those 3 Ps are the worst. And you don't want to do that.
Yeah, and Rick, you mentioned, especially in our market, but, I'm going to say regardless of the market, we still get those that their strategy is price, post, and pray. So regardless of the market.
Right.
Yep.
But that also leads me to the question, asking, how is the market? It takes me back to a story where an old owner that I used to work for, he wasn't old, but it was a long time ago. So a long time ago in my past. And he was in Palm Springs, and he was talking to a realtor at an open house and asked, how's the market? And the realtor didn't have anything to say. And you're thinking, how can I align with this realtor? You don't even know how the market is. And I took that because I refer a certain amount of business around the country, and people come to me and say, Ken, can you find somebody for me in name the city, USA? And that's the question I ask, is I'll call some brokers. First, I'll kind of sniff around online, and then I'll call a broker. I just ask the one question, hey, Tanya, how's the market? And that simple question tells me so much as to how entrenched you are in your profession, in your craft. So I don't know why I just took it there,
No,
but you reminded me of
But
that.
I think that's good, and when you are a seller, you want to kind of know, what does that agent know about how hot are they into the market? How do they know what's going on? I mean, we have something great at Keller Williams, which I love, is the total market overview,
Yes.
the TMO. I mean, we're the only ones that have that, and I love that it's put together, and we have that availability to see what is out there currently active and what is pending weekly. We know at the end of what's going on. I want to know, as a seller, what do you know about the market?
Sure.
Before I'm going to give you my biggest investment for you to post, pray, price, post, and pray.
Price,
I love
post,
that.
and
Yeah,
pray.
I love.
Yes, and this total market overview, just so our viewers
Yes.
and listeners understand, it's what it does is it breaks down the entire market according to location within Spokane, because Spokane's just a bunch of micro markets, right? I mean, what's happening on the South Hill is not necessarily happening downtown,
Right.
North Side,
5
et
Mile,
cetera,
right.
right? So it breaks down the micro markets, and then it breaks them down by price by $50,000, and then the columns are what's the inventory, list to sales price ratio, days on market. It's this whole breakdown. So that's the total market overview, or as we affectionately call it, the TMO.
And we're so lucky to have it at Keller Williams. We're
Very
the
lucky
only
to have it.
ones, because that
Yes.
helps us really have a taste and a
Yes.
a market on it.
So we want to have somebody who has a pulse on the market. That tells us you're actually working.
Exactly.
So a good question, sellers, how's the market?
Well, and what's great is it's so open-ended. Like, there's
Yes.
no cheating around that
No.
question. So when you give it a broad spot for them to land, then their expertise is really going to show up
Yes.
very quickly.
Okay, good. So I've asked, I'm writing this down as a prospective seller. I'm going to ask, how's the market? What else should I be looking for in somebody who I'm going to hire to sell my house?
So one of the things that we briefly talked about a little illustration that I had, but there's something I appreciate about, let's say the Geek Squad with Best
Yes,
Buy,
this is
right?
good.
Like the Geek Squad, I know them as the experts, right? They've marketed well. I know that that's the person I'm going to call instead of try to go search online, because I just want to be quick and efficient.
Right.
Where there's these signs that pop up on the side of the street on the weekends sometime that says something to the effect of, who needs a geek when you can have a friend? And it's someone who's also marketing around their digital expertise. But I don't want you to be my friend. I want you to fix my computer. Give me the geek. Give me the person who's
expert.
maybe not all that socially adept, but
Right.
is very adept with the technology that I want fixed, right?
They're
So
the expert in that.
They are the
in that-
expert,
yeah, in that
exactly. And
industry.
so the same thing with real estate. I want someone who's a leader, who's clear in their communication. And so one of the lines that I've shared in different contexts in my past and currently is leader first, friend second. And so when you're dealing with a transaction, you have some challenges that almost inevitably will come up. And you need someone who's going to have the confidence and the expertise to lead you through that. And then it's good to have someone who's on the sideline with you, who's a friend, right? Who can kind of coach you through, be there, shoulder to cry on, or encourager. And yet when you have those conversations with an agent, my caution would be, don't necessarily pick someone just because they're a good friend or they make you
Right.
feel good. Pick the person who you can see demonstrating that they are an expert in that field.
How often do we hear that? Well, so-and-so has a friend, or I have a friend, or a relative maybe even. And then it's like, well, how long have they been in the business? How much have they sold?
Right.
Well, the ink is still drying on their license, so
Right.
but they're ready to go. It may or may not be a sensible decision, but we hear that so often. I'm going to
Yeah.
use a friend of a friend.
I think there's maybe two things that pop up right away, and I'm sure you have some really good things to add to this, Tanya. One, someone in our office just last week in a thing called a mastermind, where we're brainstorming around these sort of things, gave a great line that I had never thought of before. But, what if it was, Ken, I so appreciate that you want to help Charlie, whose ink is still drying on his new license, and I'm sure you care about them a lot, and blah, 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 blah. But Ken, what happens if by chance they don't really perform at a level that you need them to, and you have to fire them?
Right.
Like, what kind of Thanksgiving dinner is that going to be like?
Right. Especially if, the relative, exactly.
Yeah.
Don't hire someone you can't fire.
Don't
Don't
that
hire
was the
somebody-
exact
yeah,
line
that's-
they used, and that was a huge aha. Like, ooh,
That was huge.
That was really big. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. But like I said, we hear that so often. And what I used to tell prospective sellers, I'd say, that's great, and I appreciate that, and I love loyalty. And the really good news, Rick, is that you can still hire me to sell your house, and you can still be friends
Exactly.
with so and so. And I always thought, if that resulted in you losing that friendship, were they really a friend?
Right.
We're talking about the most expensive transaction in your life in most cases, and you're going to use a friend of a friend. And I wonder, why do we hear that? Is it because the consumer thinks we do the same thing? We all do the same thing.
Right, and it's that loyalty too, though. I mean, oh, grandson just got his license, and I feel so loyal.
Sure.
I just talked to a buyer just a couple days ago, and her nephew got his license maybe 6 months ago, and he's not done any transactions, and she's the first one, and she's calling me and asking about my property, and she says, I thought he called you a couple times. That's what he says. I'm like, no, not yet. So I felt bad for her, so I gave her like kind of a rundown of what to do, but she was like, and I said, well, why are you sticking with him? She said, I just feel like I just need to give him some business. So there's that loyalty. We go back to that
Yes.
loyalty, and I would just be aware, like if you're going to sell a house, be aware of the loyalty. That's great to have that person. You want to give them some business, but you also don't want to end up in lawsuit, or you don't want to end up with losing money or leaving money on the table when you're selling your house.
That's exactly right. And you mentioned lawsuit, and something I was sharing. This is something that I consistently tell clients, is that a big part of my job, and we're talking about sellers, a big part of my job, seller, is to prevent you from getting that phone call 7 months, 8 months after the transaction has closed, and it's a lawyer
Right.
that the buyer has hired.
Yep.
Nobody wants that.
No.
Nobody wants that.
Well, I think that's an interesting point to bring up, and even sort of to segue there. What we're not saying is that someone who's a newer agent isn't a great
Thank you.
agent.
Thank you
right?
for saying
And
that.
So,
Yeah.
Thank
so
you for
that's
saying that.
What's great though is you mentioning, right, like, hey, my job is to make sure that lawyer never calls because I have done my job with a competency
Right.
that's very high. And so really, I mean, there's some agents who've been in the business for years. We've all experienced it where they don't call you back, right? They
Right.
aren't doing certain things. And so then the question becomes not so much of how many deals they've done or things of that sort, but really too, what are you doing to continue to grow in your ability to perform at a high level? And then also, who's in your world who's helping you?
Right.
Right? Because you can be a great agent, but if you don't have someone like a Ken Sax in your world,
Yeah.
who's a designated broker who understands those different pieces,
Right.
that's where, to dig a little deeper as a seller, you really want to go. So if the nephew is just starting off and it's his first deal, that's great.
Could be great.
And you're probably the person he really needs to kind of get him going, and yet how are you still being protected in that?
Right. And so I think you go back to this, Rick, is a support system. I remember my first listing, and that these people were wonderful, and they had no clue that it was my first listing, but I had so much support, so every question that they had that I didn't know how to answer, I was like, you know what, that's great. Let me take that back to, my Keller Williams support system, and we will kind of go from there. And so they were really appreciative of that, but that support system, everybody that was part of that in my agency, really my brokerage, it was perfect because it helped me be successful. So there's
Yeah,
some new, but
that's-
you want to know, like as you're interviewing for selling your house, it's okay if you've only done maybe 2 listings, but what is your
Absolutely.
support system?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I did not want it to sound like we're saying, don't hire a new broker.
No.
'Cause that's not the case.
No, definitely
So
not.
that could be a great arrangement, but ask more
Ask the
questions.
questions, dig deeper.
Yeah. What does the support look like?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that when you're saying the price, okay, so we've got the price, we've got some comps that look really good. Now you're going to put a sign in the yard. We jump into, for the agent that's going to, the seller that's interviewing that agent, what does that look like for marketing? What are you going to be doing? Are you walking the neighborhood for me? What are you going to do versus just putting the sign in the thing that goes to that price, post, and pray. That post part, just putting the sign, put a lockbox on, I'm out the door, see you, that's it. What are you going to do to market my house so everybody gets to see it? Because it's going to jump on to the online,
Well,
areas.
and what you're making me think about, that 15 years ago, I wasn't thinking about it. And as far as a question, tell me about your technology. Tell me about your ability
yep.
to market and utilize technology. And is it like Yeah, how are the Lakers doing this year? Or is it I can really dig in and explain whether it's, command system that we have at Keller Williams or some other system that
Right.
somebody may have. But is technology important today?
I think
It
just a
is,
little.
Yeah.
Where are where are they going to find your house?
Right.
Well, and that
Not in the
brings up-
newspaper.
Yeah, not in the newspaper. This is very true,
Oh my
except
gosh,
for
I was
maybe
just
like
looking through the
1995.
newspaper. No, I was just looking through
I
the
was
newspaper
too,
this
because I
morning,
just
right?
saw it. I'm like, oh, a paper.
At our lunch break, I was
so
like,
real.
should I be in here?
That's cute. Yeah. Where was I going with that? Oh, right.
Technology.
So
Technology, yeah.
15 years ago, right? I mean, I wasn't in real estate, but from what I've heard, right? I mean, the agent was much more needed on the front end.
Yes.
Right? Like you controlled all of that. And now the reality is Zillow controls it, right?
Yeah.
Realtor controls it. There's these third parties that control this information. So as agents, we need to do a heck of a lot more than just, I have someone take pictures and we put it up on Zillow. Well,
Pictures on my iPhone.
Exactly.
With a reflection of me in the bathroom mirror.
Right.
Oh my
And
gosh.
that's why we have to yes.
Seen it.
Oh, haven't we all?
Oh my gosh.
Right? And
We can we can actually
it's
do
another
another
show.
show.
Another
We can do
show.
another
All
show
right.
on photos. But
so it really is important for the seller to
Yeah.
dig in there. What does it mean that you're gonna market online?
right.
What does it mean that you're gonna go do an open house? Right? Like there's so many different ways to do that at a high level to
Yes.
where the technology and how you interact with it as an agent, it's a little bit of like that open-ended question we started with. Tell me about the market. Tell me about your technology.
Yes.
Right? If you do
Great
that,
question.
and they're like, well, Zillow, okay,
Right.
there's some more work we need to have done here.
Right. That's a great open-ended question. Tell me about your technology. One thing I think of too, as I'm thinking of all my
Yeah.
experiences with clients and sellers, I think of honesty, and I hate to just say that because it could be such an overused term. But what I mean by that is I get very frustrated with realtors who are what I consider order takers. They can't consult. They can't give you direction. They can't have tough conversations with you. They're just order takers,
Right.
which order takers will ultimately harm you. You will lose time. You will lose money. And so if that could be formulated into some kind of question where a seller could ask a prospective realtor about honesty, and as a realtor myself, a question would be something like, how important on a scale of 1 to 10 is honesty to you? And of course, we expect to hear a 10, right? Well, then, Rick and Tanya, I understand that and I appreciate that. I hear that a lot. So then you'll agree, because honesty is your most important thing. That's a 10. There are going to be times I'm going to say things that you're not going to like, but it's honest and you want me to be honest. Is that fair? And then that gives me permission to tell you things you may not want to hear, but it's to benefit you because you're dealing with emotions. So if there's some way to articulate a question that a seller could ask around that, I think that would be huge. And I'm not sure exactly what that question looks like.
I think as I'm talking, we'll think of something to ask, but to kind of circle around into that, what you've done there is establish the relationship and what that looks like.
Yes.
In
Yeah.
a real way of truthfulness, right? And so for an agent who just wants your listing to get the sign in the ground,
Yes.
Yeah.
because there's not a lot of listings and they need listings and they just say yes to everything, right? If maybe it's just if you just see that they agree with you completely, or you ask them around these kind of things, maybe the question being, Ken, maybe this is too far here, but it's like, what's something you'd be willing to walk away from if with me being your client?
Sure.
Right? Like, if you could maybe then say, well, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, or Rick, if you were to price your house $50,000 over market value, I don't want to give you false hope, and I'm not going to waste my time because I run a business and I have to be wise with the time I
Right.
spend. Now, if I was the consumer hearing that, then I see you leader first, friend second. So you're establishing things together. And what you're also doing in the way, I'm kind of veering off the question part, but when you had that, like, how honest do you want me to be? Now you have a hinge point you can go back to, right? I
Yes.
used to always tell my clients, listen, there's going to be a fire. It might be a big fire or a little fire, but almost inevitably there's a fire, and it usually happens like 3 days before closing. And so just know that that's why you have me. I'm here to help put those out and walk you through it. But during that time, I might have to remind us about this conversation we're having right now.
Yep.
because in the midst of emotion and stress, it's easy to forget that. And so that's what that reminded me of, Ken, when you said, hey, 1 out of 10 being honest, how honest you want me to be. So maybe the consumer could even just bring up that question. Hey, Realtor Ken, in this, as we move forward here, how honest should our, like take control as the consumer and see where the agent goes with it. That should probably be pretty telling.
Yeah. And just avoid order takers. Things just fall apart.
What would something be so somebody could identify how to avoid order takers?
So
I mean, what would something be that they?
Okay, so here's a story. So I had a listing that was priced. This was years ago. So it was priced around 165,000,
Okay.
probably 250 now, 165,000, and the closest comp was 175. But my seller was highly motivated because we had to get into another house and we had a time limit. So Ken, sell this house. Here's the price. They knew how much we were leaving on the table, but we had to get this house. So I get an offer and it's for like 155. And the buyer broker, who I have a great relationship with, I call her and say, explain this to me. You did see the comps. You did see where we're priced. And she said, Ken, and this is something we'll probably talk about when we get to buyers, Ken, my buyer's dad said you never pay asking price. And I thought, that is when you jump in and you become a consultant and you educate them. And I asked, so what if we were asking $1,000? Would you come in at 900? No, of course, you would come in at $1,000. Yep. So what Dad said then doesn't hold water. So there is a point where you would pay asking, and where we're priced is probably that point. That young first-time buyer did not get the house, and I sold it within the next week to somebody else. So that buyer broker, to me, is an example of an order taker who didn't have the guts or the truthful conversation, how honest you want me to be, couldn't do it, to have those tough conversations, because oftentimes, people think, I don't want to upset you, because if I upset you, you're going to fire me. So I'm just going to let you, continue walking off the cliff, but at least you won't be mad at me.
Right.
Like, what are you talking about?
So perfect. So the order taker is just kind of following what, instead of giving advice or throwing their 2 cents in, saying, this is kind of where we're sitting, the comps are high, we need to come in if we really want this house at 165, your example, versus coming in at 150 or 155. We really need to do that. So that's kind of the separation of saying, here's where we're not just going to do that. I'm going to guide you. I'm going to empower you on buying this house. And this is what that's.
Right. That's exactly right.
Okay.
So, and I just realized we have not transitioned into buyers. And so we probably have about 5 or 6 minutes left. Let's do a quick
We're having so much fun.
transition into
Sellers,
buyers. Okay, so now I'm considering going into the market. I need to buy a place. I'm interviewing buyer brokers. What are some questions I want to ask a buyer broker before I align with them?
You want to go first on that one?
No, go for it. You're on top of it.
Yeah, so I would say when it comes to working with a buyer's agent, the key is how much, it's the same thing. Like, how much do they actually know about the market, right?
Yeah.
It really is. And their truthfulness and honesty. So if you have an agent, right, currently today in Spokane, early 2020, if you have a buyer's agent that says, confident, like, I'm going to get you your house, we're going to make it happen, it's going to be a cakewalk, blah, 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 blah. It's like, well, the reality is, if you have an agent who's being honest with you, and especially it depends on the price point, back to the TMO, but let's say you're at a price point of $200,000 and that agent saying, hey, this is going to be a cakewalk, I got you covered. The reality is that agent should be saying something to the effect of, hey, you know what, this is a tight market. I'm going to do everything I can, but we need to have a real conversation up front, recognizing that there's a good possibility there's going to be multiple offers. If it's listed for 190, it might go for 210. And so is that agent going to actually, back to the what's the market like, are they going to give you an educated, accurate, real, truthful 10 out of 10 response? Because if they do that, likely they're going to be the one who's able to negotiate, who's able to make the deal happen. You really need a professional in that.
Good. Any other questions I should ask before we part?
You know what I always ask, I always say and I always ask my agent or my buyers, I say, what do you expect from your agent? Tell me what you expect from your agent. Give me the top 3 things that you expect from your agent. I want to know, and then I tell them what I expect from my buyers. Because I want to set that platform right away. Like while we're going through this whole entire thing, let's set that platform so we know what to expect.
Bingo.
Communication and honesty to me are the exact same thing. When you guys are talking about honesty, I just throw communication in there. I can be honest, but if I can't communicate to you, that might not even work. So those two are like tied together. That is so important when you're going to buy a house. This is your largest investment. I want to know, are you honest, but can you communicate that honesty to me? That's huge.
So what was the question? I'm considering hiring a buyer broker.
Yeah. What do you expect? So I always ask my buyers, what do you expect from an agent? What do you expect from an agent? And, they'll tell me, oh, I want you to be honest. Okay, great. So I write the top 3 things down that you expect from an agent.
Okay.
What do you want from me?
As a consumer, what should I ask you?
That's what I ask the consumer.
Okay.
And then the consumer, I just tell them what I expect from a buyer.
Okay.
I get to choose and pick my buyers.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure that we align perfectly because I might not be the right fit for you. You might not be the right fit for me. I want this to be empowering for you to go through and buy a house. I mean, it's so much fun to buy a house, but let's have everything on the table prior to that. So there's no surprises.
Sure.
Yeah, and maybe one more piece to add to this as well is, obviously establishing that they're an expert, asking those questions around that. The other thing I would say, though, is how many questions are they asking you, right? So if I'm working with a buyer, why do they want to buy? What are they hoping for? What are they looking for? Like going 3 deep into that, right? Well, they want 3 bedrooms. Well, tell me why you want 3 bedrooms. Or maybe they want 2 bedrooms and an office, but there's some different ways around it, but why? And so if you have an interview with an agent who's looking to work with you and you're looking to work with them and all they do is talk about themselves, that's also, I'd say, a huge red flag, right? So if you can walk away thinking that they understand you and why you want to do this, that is going to be very important because then when it does get challenging or something comes up, it just gives more depth to that relationship and the conversations.
Yep, 100%.
Good. Well, I think we have used our time here. Tanya, Tyler, Rick, Flann, thank you for joining us.
Thank
on
you,
Real
Ken.
Estate Talk. The last thing I thought of here is for sellers, consumers, just don't hyper focus on price. Like, don't hyper focus on what a firm or particular broker charges, because that tells us we're all commodities and we're not. We all are at different skill levels. We all can help you in different ways, some more than others. So don't just focus on, well, I'm going to go with the cheapest because you guys all do the same thing.
Right.
That is not the case. Believe me, I've been a designated broker for a long time, and the fights and battles and legal stuff I deal with will tell you we are not all the same.
Interview your people. That's the
Interview
only
your
thing.
people.
Interview, just like you're the employer. This is your biggest investment. You're not just going to take a bag of money to the bank and drop it down, say, I'll be back in a year.
That's right.
I mean, interview your people. So.
Exactly. Good, guys.
Hey, thank you.
You bet. Well, hey, folks, again, thanks for joining us on Real Estate Talk. I'm your host, Ken Sax, and we'll see you next time.
Ask a question, recommend a guest, or hear this program again on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Spokane Talk.